O vídeo a seguir traz um forte depoimento de avistamento de OVNI de acobertamento ufológico, trazido a público pelo oficial Neil Daniels. Confira após a vinheta. O vídeo depoimento a seguir pertence ao projeto Sirius Disclosure, do Dr. Steven Greer, a quem damos todos os créditos. O que se segue é um trecho tirado de mais de 35 horas de depoimentos de testemunhas nos arquivos 7.
Well, I went to the Air Force on December the 10th, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. And I had quite a bit of flying time before I went in, so I went through cadet school. And we graduated in November of 42, and shortly thereafter I was overseas. Ended up in England in the 8th Air Force as a pilot on B-17s. I survived 29 missions in combat and came back on home. And when I was released back to civilian status, I was fortunate enough to get a job with United Airlines. And I stayed with them for 35 years until I reached the mandatory retirement date of age 60. I started flying when I was 16 and started writing in my logbook and closed it out just the other day. After 59 years of flying, ended up with 30,000 plus hours of flight time. The one and only sighting that I had was in March of 1977. And I was flying a DC-10. This is what it looks like on a flight from San Francisco to nonstop to Boston. And it was United Flight 94. The sighting that I had was in March of 1977. And I was flying a flight from San Francisco to Boston, a DC-10. And we were about halfway between Buffalo and Albany at 37,000 feet. Cloud cover underneath, dark night, when all of a sudden the airplane started. It was on autopilot. The airplane started at about a 15-degree bank turn to the left. And of course I looked out the window to, automatically that's what you do when the airplane starts to turn. And I saw this brilliant light off. It's hard to tell exactly how far out it is, but it was very, very bright. And the first officer saw it. The second officer got out of his seat, took a look. And that's when the air traffic control in Boston wanted to know what was happening. So we told them when we figured it out, well, we'd give them a call. And about that time, the first officer hit the autopilot release button and went back to manual control. And as I was looking out the window, why this thing that we had vision, this thing that we saw, disappeared back towards the left of the airplane and to our rear at a very rapid rate. The whole event took place probably less than 3 minutes or so. So air traffic control said, okay, United 94, you're now cleared direct Albany on into Boston, J94, and so forth. The airplane was flying using the first officer's autopilot, which is connected to the captain's compass, which is out in the left wingtip of the airplane. And apparently, for some reason or other, the magnetic force was interrupted to cause the aircraft to veer off course because it's hooked up to the compass. All three compasses were giving different readings, which is very unusual. So what we gathered was it was an enormous magnetic force in whatever that ball was that we saw out there, that white light. After we turned the autopilot off and the first officer straightened out the airplane and we were advised to proceed direct to Albany, we could see Albany up ahead of us about 75 miles or so in the bright lights from the city. And the magnetic interference that had been working, it made the compasses, all different readings on it, all returned to normal after we had leveled off and started back again. And the object had disappeared away from us, so everything returned to a normal state. It was round, very, very bright light. It's hard to describe the intensity of it because it was, I've said before that the intensity of a flash bulb, the old-fashioned flash bulbs, but it didn't light up the inside of the airplane. It was just a white, bright light, round. There was no danger involved that we could see. It took off and went back and disappeared out of sight. It didn't try to make any attack on us or anything like that. Well, one thing that the co-pilot said, and this has to go into your records, he looked out the window across the cockpit at it and he says, I can hardly wait till I get home and tell my sons about this. He says, my mother had a sighting when she was a young lady over in Europe, but no one would believe her about the sighting. And that was his comment on it. After, well, let's see, it was about October, I guess, my boss and I were standing in a duck blind up by Calusa, and it was a beautiful day and the ducks weren't flying, and we were just there, and I thought, well, I'll tell him about this. So I did. I told him about the incident, and that's when he said that he was sorry that I had mentioned that, because at that time they weren't accepting the fact that there were the possibility of anything like that to be seen, and that the pilots that had seen things and talked about it, some of them were let go, some of them released from their flying and treated as nutcases and things like that. So that was the last I said of it for many, many years. The companies don't give you the message, but what they did to the first ones that did have sightings takes the case along. Don't talk about it. They have told me of their incidents and their sightings and when it happened. And one especially was a sighting back on the East Coast, and he saw this thing for a long time, something like about 18 minutes it was in view. And when he reported it to his boss, it was a different airline, not United Airlines. They investigated it, and the government said, well, that's swamp gas at 18,000 feet doing 250 knots. Swamp gas. No one wanted to really admit that there might possibly be something there. People don't want to admit the possibility that there are other entities out there that might come down to be seen here. They don't want to admit it at all. The military seems to be the one that doesn't want to admit anything. And of course, our government. Well, I talked to the first officer about this some years back, and he made it very plain to me that he didn't want to take any part in anything such as this, the taping or even relating to it. And I did mention previously that the second officer, who is now flying as a captain, had my son on board as his first officer in just about the same position. And he said, many years ago I was flying with your dad and we had a sighting right about here. Did your dad ever talk to you about it? So finally, after all of these years, he admitted to someone that he did have the sighting. But the co-pilot, he just divorced himself from the incident completely.
Se você curte ufologia, não deixe de se inscrever no nosso canal no YouTube. Marque a janelinha para receber uma notificação a cada novo vídeo. Não vai se arrepender. Saudações terráqueos e até a próxima.